Okay, so you guys are going to be doing your animal, and the first of three different exercises associated with doing this animal design is for you to do wire. And I think it's going to be really important at the front end to do the wire because it becomes like drawing. Before you can even start that, you've got to have some reference photos. And those are going to be absolutely necessary for you to have good, rich information. If you want to look at them on your phone, on your computer, I think it's helpful to have them printed out if that's a resource that you have available to you. If you have digital drawing methods and want to do drawing digitally and save the files and use that for some of your printout, or not really printout, but some of your blog posts, you can certainly do that. I've printed mine out for kind of demo purposes. Before you do that, you've got to come up with, use one of the three acceptable animals. Just imagine you're being hired to create this design that is going to be photographed for like an advertisement. So it's almost like a 3D illustration. It can have some different kind of aesthetic points of view, that sort of thing, but it has to either be a canine, which includes dogs, but there are others. It can be a bird, or it can be an animal in the bovine family, which includes cattle and sheep, among others. You have Google at your fingertips, use it. Google, Wikipedia, any of those. But you can look up those to see what all is included in that. Okay, so I have printed out examples, some photographs, not because they're great photographs, but because they can actually provide some different information. And you want to look for photographs that are different angles because it's going to provide information about the anatomy of your animal and about different aspects of what that anatomy looks like at different poses. And so as you're kind of looking for your animal, if you can find a skeletal, so that might be something that I'm like, oh, that would be really helpful. Let me find a skeletal image of a dog that looks very similar to this. This is my dog, and it was just easy to kind of snap a few photographs. I have a photograph from above looking down when she's seated. I have a photograph of her from the side so I can kind of get the sort of chest. I have gotten a photograph of her in a kind of funny pose. I don't know that I would have her kind of going after this bone, but I like that pose where it's the play pose where their butt is kind of up in the air, or they're kind of chewing on a bone, or they're kind of working on prey or something like that, depending on the story that I ultimately decide I want to kind of have with this. And then, a kind of seated pose. And so what your goal with doing any of the drawing is to begin looking at the form and the volume. It is not about the fur. It's not about the eyes. It's not about the feathers if you're doing an animal. It's not about those superficial things, but really looking at the planes and volumes and understanding what that might look like in 3 dimensions. And so, with this one, this was the sort of play pose that she's in this image here. And I know it's really dark, but I was just studying the sort of overall gesture of her body, just sort of imagining what would be the central axis. I think almost any of these where you can kind of think about the central spine and work off of that, you're going to be in better shape than if you try to isolate leg 1, leg 2, leg 3, head, torso. But if you have an ongoing kind of silhouette, or you have a kind of long line in terms of the wire, a long line that kind of comes out and goes down the entire body, that becomes a sort of core structure, you're going to do better. And then if you have to have secondary elements to define the roundness or the volume, then you can do that. And so I was sort of doing that here as sort of imagining what would the volume, sort of the roundness, and it's not perfectly round, but what would the roundness of that kind of part of the body look like? I ultimately might encourage you to avoid the sort of compulsion of keeping the sort of like, if you were thinking about this in the sort of cage work kind of manner, of kind of avoid the compulsion to necessarily keep everything parallel and perpendicular. I've sort of done that here, but in many instances, if you kind of have things that are going more at an angle, it sort of gives a little more of the complexity of the contour. And if you have a couple of your drawings that are going parallel and perpendicular, don't worry about it. It's not a big deal, but I want you just to kind of get in the mindset of like, don't default to your, one way, and look at things and just kind of go with it and study it. These drawings are really just meant to be a study in how one might analyze and just get that information. Whereas when I moved over here, and you can actually draw directly on your photograph, I think that can be really good, whether you do that digitally, if you've got Procreate or some other drawing app and you really feel comfortable and confident in there, you can pop a photograph in Procreate or another app and draw directly on it if you've got an app that you like to do that with, that you're confident and proficient. But you can always print it out and trace over it or just draw it. And so by tracing over it, you begin to kind of break things down and you look at where kind of the high points and low points and the proportions and the planes and that sort of thing are, and to kind of break down, if I had a piece of wire, how would this go? One of the things with wire and even kind of with cardboard is, the first thing you want to get is sort of a central spine, but also in terms of the wire, and I'm going to talk separately about that because that is the first of the armature studies that you're going to be doing. And just to remind you, if you see this word armature coming up, an armature is a core structure used for stability and strength of a sculpture. And there's usually some kind of covering over that gives the final finish. And so we're doing 3 days of armature studies that provide, one, information about, an opportunity for you to study your animal and to determine your pose that you're ultimately going to use. So technically you may have poses different with each one. You're not required to do different poses with each one, but you might end up doing that. 2, it provides you information, just understanding of your animal. And then 3, it helps you know which of the techniques you might ultimately want to use for your main project. So we're going to be doing 3 days of preliminary study. They can be smaller and then, and they really should be smaller than what you're going to do for the large project. These are 3 separate images, forms, objects that you make, and then that will lead to your main project. As you're getting started this week, we'll be covering this at least partially in our weekly meeting, but most of that is going to be to the critique. That's why I wanted to do this video. And I will be supplementing with another couple of videos to talk a little bit about the tools and materials. At least that's my plan, just to make sure you can kind of go into this with a degree of confidence and kind of, proceed from there. But just think about this, the 3 days of the sort of exercises and startup of the project as a way to figure out which pose, which animal, which pose, and which technique you're going to be using in the animal project. So this is really about a month-long project. And so we have 3 days of study, preliminary study, and then we move into the larger production kind of stage of this. And all the details are in the weekly folder, and they will be continually kind of rolled out with that information. But this week we're going to be doing wire as our first one that we're going to do. So anyway, you guys can always contact me with questions and I will follow up and we'll look at what you submit this week and we'll go from there.